It sounded like nothing. Just a child talking because children talk, filling silence with whatever floats into their head. She was small enough that her feet didn't touch the floor, shoes dangling, scuffed at the toes. One lace was untied. She kept tapping the chair leg with her heel, a quiet rhythm nobody noticed at first. The room smelled faintly of coffee and metal and something sterile, like places that get cleaned too often. The men around her had learned how to read rooms, how to catch details without staring. Even then, none of them were paying attention to her words. She wasn't the focus. She wasn't supposed to be. She was there because she had nowhere else to be. Because adults make decisions and kids get carried along. She had been coloring earlier, a page folded and unfolded so many times the creases wouldn't flatten. Someone had given her a blue marker that was running out of ink. She pressed harder and harder, trying to make it work, tongue stuck out in concentration. Eventually, she gave up and started talking instead, swinging her legs, humming a tune she didn't quite remember. One of the men had his sleeves rolled up. It was hot in the room, or maybe he was just used to heat. The tattoo on his forearm was partially faded, edges softened by time and sun. Most people would have seen shapes, lines, something vaguely symbolic. If they noticed it at all, they'd assume it was a reminder of a unit, a deployment, a phase of life that ended years ago. People saw tattoos like that everywhere. Bars, beaches, airports. Nobody ever asked the right questions. The girl glanced at it the way kids glance at everything, without weight or caution. Her eyes lingered for half a second longer than expected. Then she smiled, not because it was funny, but because recognition makes kids happy. It makes the world feel smaller and safer. My mom has that same tattoo. She said it the way someone might say your car is the same color as theirs. No emphasis, no mystery, just a fact she thought might be interesting. Her voice was light, almost bored. She leaned back in the chair and started twisting a loose thread on the seat cushion, already moving on in her head. For a heartbeat, nothing happened. Sound didn't vanish. The room didn't go silent. But something shifted anyway. Air got heavier. The tapping heel stopped. One man froze with his hand halfway to his coffee cup. Another lifted his head slowly, like he was surfacing from deep water. They all knew the tattoo. They all knew what it meant. More importantly, they knew what it didn't mean. It wasn't something you copied. It wasn't something you saw online and decided looked cool. It wasn't shared, replicated, or explained. It belonged to a moment that existed off the record, tied to names that were never written down, tied to a promise that ended in blood and fire and orders given in clipped, final tones. It was supposed to end with them. Kids weren't supposed to recognize it. Mothers weren't supposed to have it. One of the men opened his mouth to speak, then closed it again. Another looked at the girl, really looked this time, noticing the shape of her nose, the way her eyebrows tilted when she concentrated, the familiar stubborn set of her jaw. Details snapped into focus that hadn't mattered seconds before. Family resemblances were dangerous things when you weren't expecting them. The girl kept twisting the thread, oblivious. She says it's old, she added, still casual. She says it's from before she was my mom. That was when the room truly stilled. Not because of fear, not because of shock, because of recognition arriving all at once, sharp and unwelcome. Because a sentence meant nothing on its own until it landed in the wrong ears. Because something hidden had just surfaced without effort or intent. Because the one thing designed to stay buried had been pointed at by a child who didn't know she was pointing at anything at all. It was easy to miss if you didn't know what you were looking at. Just ink on skin, faded by years of sun and salt and sweat. The lines weren't sharp anymore. Time had softened them, blurred the edges, made it look like something personal rather than precise. To anyone else, it could have been a reminder of a younger life, a symbol picked from a wall of designs, a story told after one too many drinks. People like to think tattoos always came with explanations. This one didn't. The design was small on purpose. Not flashy, not centered where attention would land. It sat where a sleeve could hide it, where a watch strap might cover part of it, where it could pass without comment. That was always the point. It wasn't meant to be seen. It wasn't meant to be remembered by anyone outside a very narrow circle. The fewer eyes that landed on it, the better. It wasn't chosen. It was assigned. Back then, it marked a line that couldn't be crossed. You got it only after something specific happened, something that never appeared in reports or after-action summaries. No photographs, no citations, no medals pinned in public ceremonies. Just a quiet moment where someone nodded once and said it was done. The ink came later, in a place that didn't ask questions and didn't keep records. Cash paid. Names never shared. Each line stood for something exact. A location that didn't exist on maps. A date that wasn't written anywhere else. A decision that couldn't be undone. To the men who carried it, the tattoo wasn't memory. It was accountability. It meant you were there. It meant you saw what happened and did what was required. It meant you would never talk about it, not even with each other, not even years later when the details blurred and sleep came harder. They learned quickly how to live with it. You stop seeing your own tattoos after a while. They become part of you, like scars or knuckles that never quite healed right. You forget how strange they might look to someone else. You forget how heavy meaning can sit inside something so small. The ink stayed silent because everyone who knew what it meant stayed silent too. That silence was part of the agreement, which was why hearing it spoken aloud, even indirectly, felt wrong in a way that was hard to explain. Not dangerous at first, just wrong. Like seeing a classified document taped to a refrigerator door. Like hearing a code word used in casual conversation. Your brain rejected it before logic had time to catch up. The tattoo wasn't passed down. It wasn't inherited. It wasn't shared between units or branches. It was never taught, never described, never explained to spouses or friends. If someone asked about it, you shrugged it off. Old team. Old deployment. People accepted that. They always did. Most people didn't actually want answers. They wanted the comfort of an explanation that let them move on. Only a handful of people in the world could look at that design and know exactly what it signified. Fewer still were alive. Even fewer were still connected to one another. Some had disappeared into civilian lives that didn't touch this one anymore. Some had died with their secrets intact. Some carried the weight quietly, letting it surface only in small habits, in the way they scanned rooms, in the way they never fully relaxed. For it to appear again, attached to someone else, was unthinkable, not because it was impossible, but because it violated the unspoken rules that had kept everyone safe. That tattoo wasn't a badge. It was a seal. Once it was broken, there was no pretending it hadn't been. It meant someone else had been there, or someone had survived when they shouldn't have, or someone had carried that mark out of the shadows and into a life that included school drop-offs and grocery lists, and a child who spoke without knowing the cost of her words. The meaning of the tattoo had never changed. The world around it had. And that was the problem. They had been trained for chaos, but this wasn't chaos. Chaos made sense to them. It had patterns, even when it was loud and violent. You learned how to move through it, how to narrow your focus until nothing existed beyond the next decision. Years of repetition drilled that into them until it lived in muscle memory. Breathing slowed. Hands stayed steady. Fear became background noise. That training had saved their lives more times than they could count. This was different. There was no protocol for a child's voice cutting through a room and landing on something that was never meant to be named. No checklist. No immediate action to take. You couldn't secure the perimeter of a sentence that had already been spoken. You couldn't call for extraction from a realization that bloomed silently in your chest. Their instincts kicked in anyway, because instincts always do. Eyes moved first. Not in panic, but in calculation. Who heard it? Who noticed the shift? Who was looking at whom? Years of habit had them scanning faces, gauging reactions, reading posture and breath. But there was nothing to assess. No threat to neutralize. No enemy to identify. Just each other, frozen in place, all understanding the same thing at the same time. They were trained to compartmentalize, to lock things away until they could be dealt with later. It worked when the danger was external, when it was a door that might be booby-trapped or a road that might explode. You pushed the thought aside and did the job. But this didn't come from outside the wire. It came from memory, from something they thought had been sealed and buried under layers of time and distance. One of them felt his pulse pick up, sharp and fast, like the start of a firefight. His hands twitched, wanting to do something, anything, just to release the tension. Another felt heat crawl up his neck, the same heat he used to feel right before things went wrong, when the air itself seemed to warn you. But nothing was happening. That was the problem. There was nothing to react to. Training teaches you to expect certain outcomes. If this happens, do that. If the situation changes, adapt. This situation had no map, no branch in the decision tree that led here. They hadn't rehearsed what to do if the past reached out and tapped you on the shoulder in the form of a child who didn't know your name. They had learned to control their faces, to keep reactions minimal, but this caught them mid-breath. A half-second delay was all it took. A glance held too long. A jaw tightening. The smallest tells, the kind they spent careers looking for in others, now betraying them. What unsettled them most wasn't fear. It was uncertainty. Missions failed. People got hurt. Those were things you could process, in time. This was a question without an answer. It cracked open assumptions they'd built their lives on. That chapter was closed. Those names were gone. The accounting was finished. Or so they believed. One man thought about the debriefs, about the way the room had smelled back then, about the exact phrasing used to explain why certain details would never be discussed again. Another remembered the long flight home, staring at his hands, trying to reconcile what he'd done with who he was supposed to be. They had all carried those memories, heavy but contained, each in his own way. Now those compartments rattled. Not open yet, but no longer sealed. Training could tell you how to hold a position under fire, how to keep moving when everything in you wanted to stop. It couldn't tell you how to face the possibility that something you mourned might still exist, reshaped, renamed, living a life that never intersected with yours until now. They prided themselves on control, on the ability to stay mission-focused no matter what personal storms were brewing underneath. But control relies on predictability, on understanding the terrain. This terrain was emotional, historical, and completely uncharted. For the first time in a long time, they didn't know what the right move was. And that shook them more than any gunshot ever had. It was never called a mission in the usual sense. No code name that could be repeated later. No patch. No unit photo. The orders came quietly, passed hand to hand, spoken in low voices that carried weight because they were rare. When something arrived that way, you understood it lived outside the normal structure. It existed because it had to, not because it fit anywhere neatly. They were told only what they needed. A location that wasn't labeled, a target that wasn't meant to be taken alive, and a window of time that couldn't be missed. The briefing was short, almost sterile. No room for questions. The room felt smaller than it was, lights humming overhead, a map projected, and then shut off as soon as everyone had seen enough. When it ended, no one lingered. They nodded once and dispersed, each man already shifting into the mindset required to do something irreversible. The insertion was clean. Too clean, in hindsight. Whether cooperating when it shouldn't have. No resistance where intelligence suggested there might be some. That alone should have been a warning, but experience teaches you not to argue with luck. You take it and move fast before it changes its mind. They moved like they always did, efficient and quiet, covering angles without speaking, trusting each other with the kind of confidence that only comes from shared risk. Inside, everything happened quickly, faster than memory likes to replay it. A door forced, a shadow moving where it shouldn't, a split-second decision that couldn't be taken back once it was made. The kind of moment that defines a life whether you want it to or not. Training carried them through, but training doesn't erase awareness. You still know exactly what your hands are doing. There was someone there who wasn't on the briefing. Someone who made eye contact in the middle of it all. That look lingered longer than it should have, burned itself into memory with a clarity that refused to fade. It wasn't fear. It wasn't defiance. It was recognition and confusion, and something like understanding arriving too late to matter. They finished what they were sent to do. They always did. The exfil was messy, alarms finally screaming, the night lit up in harsh flashes. Adrenaline flattened everything into sharp edges and narrow focus. By the time they were airborne, breathing hard, gears streaked with grime, the mission was already being filed away as completed. The debrief was where things got strange. Questions were asked that didn't match the operation they'd just run. Certain details were skipped entirely. Others were repeated, almost too carefully. When one of them tried to clarify a timeline, the response was a pause and a look that said enough. You learn to read those looks early in your career. They mean stop. They mean this goes no further. They were told the outcome was final. The threat neutralized. No survivors. No loose ends. The phrasing was deliberate. Finality wrapped in official language. It was meant to settle something, to close a book that had been open too long. The tattoo came afterward, not as a reward, as a mark. A way of saying you were part of something that couldn't be acknowledged but would follow you anyway. It wasn't optional. Refusing it wasn't discussed. You either accepted the mark or you accepted that you would never fully belong again. Over time, the mission blurred at the edges, like all memories do. Certain faces faded. Sounds softened. What remained were fragments. A hallway. A doorframe. The weight of a decision that made sense in the moment and haunted you later in quieter ways. They learned to live with it because there was no alternative. Every so often, something would surface. A news item that made your stomach tighten. A face in a crowd that looked too familiar. You told yourself it was nothing. You had been told it was final. You trusted the process because you had to. That mission was supposed to stay buried because digging it up served no one. It belonged to a version of the world that no longer existed, and to men who had accepted the cost of doing what was asked of them. It was sealed by silence, reinforced by time, and guarded by the certainty that some things, once done, could not echo forward into ordinary life. The first thought wasn't hope. It was resistance, an immediate, almost physical rejection of the idea, as if the mind itself pushed back to protect something fragile. They had lived too long with certainty to let it crack easily. Certainty was how you survived. Certainty was how you slept. You didn't question outcomes that had already been accounted for, names already spoken in past tense. But once the thought appeared, it didn't leave. It started small, almost reasonable. A single inconsistency. A detail that didn't line up the way it should. They told themselves there were explanations. There were always explanations. Ink could be copied. Stories could be misunderstood. Kids mixed things up. Memory was unreliable. They had all seen how people filled gaps with imagination. It would have been easier if that were true. Then the other details crept in. The timing. The age of the child. The way recognition had come too naturally to be coincidence. The way the tattoo had been described, not just seen. Exact enough to be unsettling. The part of their minds trained to look for patterns began doing what it always did, connecting dots whether they wanted it to or not. Someone said it quietly, not as a statement, but as a question, barely audible. No one responded, but no one dismissed it either. Silence settled in the space where denial should have lived. That silence was louder than argument. They remembered the moment they were told it was over. The phrasing. The confidence with which it had been delivered. How final had sounded absolute at the time. But final depended on information, and information depended on honesty. They had trusted both without hesitation because that was the structure they operated in. Trust wasn't optional. Now that trust wavered. If she wasn't gone, then something had gone wrong. Or something had been hidden. Or something had been allowed to happen without their knowledge. None of those possibilities sat well. Each one suggested a fracture in the system they believed in. And worse, a fracture in their own understanding of what they had done. They replayed the mission without meaning to. Not the whole thing, just fragments, slowed and magnified. The look that had lingered. The moment that felt unfinished even then. At the time, they had buried it under procedure and aftermath and orders. Now it surfaced with clarity that made their chests tighten. One of them thought about the weight he'd carried for years, the quiet acceptance that some losses were permanent and had to be borne without question. He had made peace with it, or something close to peace. The idea that this weight might have been unnecessary or misplaced stirred something sharp and unfamiliar. Another felt anger rise, sudden and hot. Not at her, not at the child, but at the possibility that they had been maneuvered into believing a version of events that wasn't complete. Anger was easier than confusion. Anger had edges. Confusion just sat there, heavy and unresolved. If she was alive, then she had lived with consequences they never saw. She had built a life that ran parallel to theirs without intersecting. carrying a past that could never be explained fully. She had chosen silence too, or been forced into it. Either way, the thought of her moving through the world unseen, unacknowledged, made the years in between feel suddenly fragile. They wondered if she had watched from a distance. If she had ever looked up names she wasn't supposed to know. If she recognized them the way they were beginning to recognize her presence now, retroactively, in places it shouldn't have existed. The idea that she might have known they were alive while they believed she was gone unsettled them in ways they couldn't articulate. This wasn't about reunion. That word felt wrong, almost offensive. It was about reckoning. About the possibility that the story they told themselves to survive had missing pages. About the realization that something unresolved had been moving forward in time alongside them, gathering weight, gathering meaning, until it finally brushed against them through a child's careless honesty. They didn't know what it meant yet. They didn't know what would happen next. But the certainty they had relied on was gone, replaced by something far more dangerous than doubt. Possibility. Truth had always been something they treated carefully, not because it was fragile, but because it was powerful. In their world, truth was managed, segmented, released only when it served a purpose. You learned early that full truth was rarely necessary, and sometimes dangerous. What mattered was operational truth, the version that allowed people to move forward and sleep at night. They had lived inside that version for years. The story they believed was clean. Brutal, but clean. An operation carried out. A threat eliminated. A cost paid. Grief processed in the quiet way men like them process grief, by not speaking of it, and by letting time do what it could. The truth, as they understood it, had edges but no loose ends. Now those edges frayed. One sentence had shifted the frame, and suddenly the past looked different. Not rewritten yet, but distorted, like a reflection in cracked glass. The events themselves hadn't changed. What changed was the meaning attached to them. The assumptions that had once felt solid now felt provisional, dependent on information they might never have had. They realized how much of their certainty had been built on trust. Trust in briefings. Trust in debriefs. Trust in the quiet authority of people who spoke in absolutes. If those absolutes were wrong, even by omission, then the foundation shifted under everything that followed. It forced them to revisit moments they had filed away as settled. Not to relive them emotionally, but to re-examine them logically. What had been seen? What had been assumed? What had been confirmed? And what had simply been accepted because confirmation wasn't offered? They had been trained not to ask certain questions. That training had worked. The truth they believed had given them permission to move on, to build lives that didn't constantly circle back to one night, one location, one irreversible decision. It allowed them to compartmentalize guilt, grief, and responsibility in ways that were survivable. That version of truth had been functional. This new version wasn't functional yet. It raised questions that had no clear answers. If someone had survived, who knew? Who decided what to say and what to withhold? Whether the silence that followed had been mutual or imposed? Whether the child's existence was an accident of fate or the result of choices made deliberately in the shadows? They began to understand how easily truth could diverge depending on where you stood. For them, truth had been an ending. For her, if she was who they suspected, truth may have been something unfinished, something carried forward quietly, reshaped into something livable. The same set of facts, interpreted in two completely different directions. It unsettled them to think that while they were closing a chapter, someone else might have been opening one. While they were mourning, someone else was surviving. While they were learning how to live with an absence, someone else was learning how to live with a secret. Truth, they realized, wasn't just about what happened. It was about who got to define what it meant. The realization didn't bring clarity. It brought responsibility. If the story they believed was incomplete, then continuing to live as if it were complete felt wrong. But acting on that realization came with risks they understood all too well. Some truths stayed buried because unearthing them caused damage that couldn't be undone. They also understood that once you see the cracks, you can't unsee them, even if nothing came of it, even if they never confirmed a single suspicion. The certainty they once had was gone. In its place was a quieter, heavier awareness that truth could exist in parallel versions, each convincing, each incomplete. They found themselves wondering how many other things in their lives were built on similar assumptions. How many conclusions had been reached because they were necessary, not because they were fully true. The question wasn't comfortable, and it wasn't abstract anymore. A child's sentence had done what years of discipline and structure had prevented. It had reopened a closed system. It had introduced ambiguity where there had been finality. It had reminded them that truth doesn't always arrive through investigations or confessions or official channels. Sometimes it arrives casually, spoken without intent, carried by someone who has no idea they're holding something that can't be put back the way it was, something that forces everything you thought you knew to rearrange itself around a new, uncertain center.